Alright guys, so we got some pretty major breaking news here as the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, has officially dropped their preliminary judgment as to whether or not Israel is plausibly in violation of the Genocide Convention from this case that was brought by South Africa back in late December. So I'm going to read to you guys a lot of the details here as broken down by The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill. He did a good job of summarizing all of this, but really the short of it is that the ICJ overwhelmingly sided with South Africa in this case. Now, there's a pretty big caveat to that because they did not rule or give a judgment on, trying to force Israel to engage in an immediate ceasefire. So that's the one area where they came up short. And basically on every other aspect of this case, they sided with South Africa on the facts of it, on the evidence that was presented, on the intent nature of genocide from all of those statements that we talked about from top Israeli representatives and politicians and military figures. Overwhelmingly, like by votes of 15-2 or 16-1, they sided with South Africa on every single point. So we're going to go through some of those points here later in the video, but let's just go ahead and read some of the details here. He says, ICJ ruling on Gaza genocide is a historic victory for the Palestinians that Israel vows to defy. So we're going to cover some of the immediate responses here from Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir and their reaction to this ICJ ruling. Surprise, surprise, they're not very happy about it, but Jeremy says, it found that there is no basis to proceed, or that there is a basis, to proceed with the case against Israel for genocide, and that South Africa had solid foundation to bring its case before the court. The ICJ's chief judge, Joan Donoghue, said provisional measures against Israel were necessary because, quote, the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is at a serious risk of deteriorating further before the court renders its final judgment. And again, the full proceedings may take a couple of years. But they say at the same time, the court did not go as far in its rulings as South Africa wished and did not explicitly order Israel to immediately halt its military attacks against Gaza or to lift its state of siege, which is kind of surprising in a way, right? Because you would think that if on every other metric you're saying that there is a plausible or a plausibility that Israel is committing a genocide, that you would then tack on with that, maybe you should stop committing the genocide. But again, they're going to circle back in a month and Israel's going to have to go and, reaffirm their case in front of the court and tell them how exactly they've adapted in the aftermath of this ruling. So, again, it's not everything that South Africa was looking for, that the world was looking for, but it's pretty significant. They say, instead, it ordered Israel to, quote, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention, saying that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the court said. And I mean, keep in mind, I've covered so many different stories of Israel, just brazenly getting in the way of any sort of humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. They blocked like upwards of 70% of the shipments. They've been, incredibly, the word was cumbersome in that one story that we talked about a week ago at this point. And basically, the trucks come in, Israel empties out the trucks. If there's one tiny thing that they even think in a hypothetical way could be manufactured into a weapon of sorts, then they reject the entirety of the truck and it has to go back around, complete the entire process again. We also had recent videos that have come out that I haven't covered on this channel of Israeli civilians working most likely in coordination with the Israeli military to go and protest the shipments of humanitarian aid into Gaza and standing in the way of some of the trucks. And so over the last couple of days, there's been basically no aid that's been getting into Gaza. And obviously you've had top Israeli politicians as well who have come out and denied even the need for any aid or any food or medical supplies, as I've talked about previously before. So obviously the humanitarian situation is as catastrophic as it can possibly get, the worst in the world at the moment. And so it's important that this is actually something that is enforced, obviously, and we'll talk about the enforcement mechanisms that are potentially at play in the future, because the ICJ doesn't have a military. They can't go and force Israel to stop what they're doing, but there are other measures that can be deployed to try to bring an end to it. But they say it also ordered Israel to halt and to punish incitement to genocide, to preserve any evidence of violations of the Genocide Convention by its forces or personnel, and to submit a report on its compliance with the court's orders within 1 month Okay, so they have to keep all of this evidence. I mean, the incitement to genocide part is really interesting because with that aspect of it, with all of these, as he cites here, these statements from top Israeli officials, right? The genocidal intent aspect. I mean, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, no electricity, no food, no fuel. Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, we are fighting human animals, right? It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. With all of the statements from Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, when we're talking about, punishing people, or holding them accountable for incitement to genocide, that would implicate basically the entirety of the upper echelons of the Israeli government, as well as many other, soldiers and even potentially some media personnel or, spokespeople. And so that in and of itself is pretty major there, right? And you could even probably implicate some U.S. politicians as well for incitement to genocide, but that's a separate question. They say it also represents, this entire case, a technical coup for Israel, which has already argued that it is not committing genocidal acts. The bottom line is that the court has ruled that Israel should stand trial on charges of genocide in Gaza, but the judges carved out a significant loophole that Israel can exploit to continue its war on Gaza. And Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed that no one will stop the war against Gaza, including The Hague. Remember that tweet that he sent out where he said, nobody's going to stop us, not The Hague, not the International Court of Justice, nobody, right? I mean, pretty ominous. They say the court's decision not to order an immediate cessation of the military assault is already being emphasized in Tel Aviv. And I've seen this with a lot of pro-Israel accounts online as well, where they're going around and doing a victory lap, as if they somehow won this case. I mean, it's I don't know if it's delusion, I don't know if it's just the propaganda game that they're trying to play, but the idea that Israel won this case is utterly absurd. I mean, yes, the ICJ didn't call for an immediate, ceasing of their military operations in Gaza, but you lost overwhelmingly by wide margins on the actual facts that were presented and the important key measures here, which is, are you committing a genocide? You lost on all of those measures, and they're running around parading this as if it's some sort of a victory. Oh, we've been vindicated. Vindicated? You've been the opposite of vindicated. They say Naledi Pandor, the South Africa's minister of international relations, said outside the court that she was grateful for the court's ruling, but wished that it had ordered, obviously, an explicit attack or halt to Israel's attacks. She argued that the court's orders would not be enforceable if Israel does not actually cease its military attacks in a state of siege, saying without a ceasefire, the order doesn't actually work. And that's true, obviously, right? The U.S. government has long shielded Israel from international legal consequences for its actions against Palestinians both in Gaza and the West Bank. And the only enforcement mechanism here for the rulings from the ICJ resides at the UN Security Council, where the U.S. regularly wields its veto power. Okay, so that's an important key aspect of this. Basically, I don't know what the timetable on this is going to be. Maybe it's in the next couple of days or weeks. But you're going to have the UN Security Council that is going to bring up a vote that essentially is saying, should we adopt this ruling by the International Court of Justice, right? And that will have massive implications in terms of actually getting enforcement mechanisms to apply pressure on Israel to get a ceasefire, to stop their actions in Gaza. And so then the big question becomes, is the United States, as we basically have always done throughout history, going to use their veto power on the UN Security Council in order to prevent that from happening? And that would take this to an entirely different level, right? Because then you're not only doing what we've talked about here and as pointed out by Prem, right? You're not only denying this case, you're not only denying the facts on the ground of what Israel is doing and pretending as if they're not in violation of international law or human rights laws or that they're not committing war crimes, right? You're not only denying all of that, but then if you veto it at the UN Security Council, you would then be taking active steps, in front of the entire world after the ICJ, the UN's highest court, has made a ruling that Israel is plausibly committing a genocide. So it takes it up to an entirely different level than even what the US has already been doing, which was obviously egregious as well. But just as a reminder here, January 3rd, John Kirby calls the suit meritless and counterproductive and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever. Think about that. This is one of the top spokespeople for the Pentagon, John Kirby, and he's coming out completely without any basis in fact whatsoever. No facts in that case were legitimate in his eyes. It's completely meritless. Not only that, but it's counterproductive, according to him. Right? Anthony Blinken the same. Oh, it's meritless. Kirby then doubled down a week later. And then you had 210 Republicans and Democrats express disgust at the suit and echoed Kirby's remarks. So, really think about that. This is our government. No basis in fact whatsoever. It's ludicrous. It's outrageous that you would make that kind of a statement. I mean, it's one thing to say we have a disagreement on this issue that South Africa presented, or we think they misframed this, or they got this fact wrong, and here's our counter evidence. That would be one thing. They don't even bother to do any of that. They just completely, out of hand. They just toss it away. It's completely meritless. With all of the facts that we talked about of what was presented in the ICJ case, right? The genocidal intent in the form of these statements from top Israeli politicians and officials and military, members, right? The actions on the ground of destroying hospitals and schools and UN shelters and refugee camps, the proportionality of the amount of civilians you're killing to militants that you're killing, upwards of 90, 80% at the minimum, right? The amount of children, at this point, over 13,000 who have been killed. I mean, the idea that this is not genocidal, the idea that, not even if you don't like that word genocidal, the idea that they're following international law is completely absurd. And so to ignore all of the facts of that case is just disgusting. And now, not only were the facts against you of what's actually happening on the ground, but now the International Court of Justice is also against you, right? So, I mean, here are the final votes. The ICJ votes 15-2. Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent all acts violating the Geneva Convention on genocide, right? Israel shall ensure that its military does not commit any acts of genocide. Israel must punish all incitements to commit genocide. Israel must take immediate and effective steps to provide humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Israel shall take effective measures to avoid destruction and preserve evidence of actions in relation to the Geneva Convention. And Israel must report to the court again within 1 month. Look at all of these votes. I mean, overwhelming. So, I mean, you have the U.S. still standing against this, right? Even though it's undeniable at this point. We also had this good question here that was asked by Ryan Grimm, and he was pressing this State Department spokesperson, Vedant Patel, and he was basically pressing him on, like, look, what does it mean for the concept of international law, or the United States pretending to be the global police, the enforcers of international law, if you're just going to ignore what the ICJ's ruling is? So this was from yesterday before the ruling came out, and notice how he squirms around, trying to avoid giving a definitive answer here.
I'll come back to you. Ryan, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
To the ICJ question,
Yeah.
Setting aside opining on how the preliminary verdict might come out, would the U.S. at least commit to not vetoing enforcement of whatever the court rules, one way or the other?
I'm not going to commit to any action from up here. That's
but to
not
pick up
how
on
the
Matt's
policy
question from
works.
earlier, doesn't that undermine the U.S. insistence that other countries ought to follow these court rulings? What does it leave of the kind of rules-based order if countries can pick and choose decisions?
That's certainly not what I was indicating. Again, I think we need to take a step back here because a decision has not come down, and no one here knows, unless you can tell the future, what exactly that will be. I'm not going to commit any U.S. government action from up here within the auspices of any body. What I can say is that we believe that the allegations that started this process, that Israel is committing genocide, we believe those to be unfounded. Simultaneously, though, we'll continue to raise with our Israeli partners the moral and strategic imperative that they need to take additional steps to minimize deaths on civilians.
Okay. I mean, it's just fucking pathetic, man. It's so pathetic, right? The question is pretty clear. Will you abide by the ICJ's ruling, regardless of which way it goes? And in his head, his gears are turning because I feel like he wants to say, like, well, if they rule in favor of Israel, then yeah, we'll abide by it. If they rule in favor of South Africa, then of course we're going to veto it. I mean, that's basically what he wants to say here. And the underlying premise, which is why it's a good question from Ryan, is that, there's really no way that this reflects positively on the United States, on the concept of international justice and the frameworks that we have set up in the West, right? And what I mean by that is that, if the ICJ had ruled against this and they had said there's no plausibility that Israel is committing a genocide, well, then that destroys your legitimacy in the eyes of most of the world in terms of being a neutral arbiter of actual international law, because they're clearly in violation of international law. But then if they do, which they now have, ruled that it is plausible that Israel's committing a genocide, and then the United States vetoes that, well, then the U.S. just destroyed their credibility, if there really even is any left, in terms of being the, standard for international law. And, we believe that every country should be held accountable when they're in violation of these things, except for us, and except for Israel, and except for any other of our friends around the world, right? This only applies to, the global south, basically, is what the United States wants. The Genocide Convention, all of these other international, laws, that only applies to countries that we're not necessarily close buddies with. That's basically what's happening here, right? And so it's a good question there from Ryan, so shout out to him. And so we'll have to see how the United States actually does respond to this ruling. It'll be very interesting if Joe Biden wants to dig himself even, deeper into this mess. We also had this here again from Itamar Ben-Gvir, the National Security Minister of Israel. He was denouncing the International Court of Justice for these provisional measures, labeling the international body as anti-Semitic. The minister urges disregarding the court's decisions, stating decisions that endanger the continued existence of the state of Israel must not be listened to. So just straight up ignoring international law, ignoring the International Court of Justice. Oh, they're anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic. Cheapening actual, threats of anti-Semitism, which is real. There is real anti-Semitism. Mostly comes from the far right, believe it or not. Fascists, Nazis. But you are actually cheapening, real concern and action that should be taken to address real anti-Semitism by saying that what? The International Court of Justice is anti-Semitic? I mean, all of these judges from the United States, from your closest allies, they're all anti-Semitic. South Africa, they're all anti-Semitic. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous, and it's disgusting. It is disgusting. It's the same thing when here in the United States, people try to tie together Judaism with Israel. They're not the same thing. Israel is a government. Israel is a state. It's a country with a military, okay? And their own policy framework. It is not a representation of Judaism. They use religious justifications to commit atrocities sometimes, but that's not the same. You should never blame the entire religion, right? In the same way that you could have disagreements with the government of Saudi Arabia, and then that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a condemnation of Islam, for example. It's a pretty simple concept, but they use this in such twisted ways to try to claim that anybody who is critical of the government of Israel must therefore be anti-Semitic, right? And it's also disgusting in the sense that they frequently bring up the Holocaust, right? They did it during the ICJ case. And they bring up the Holocaust in order to try to justify what they are doing. And that to me is so beyond the pale, right? Because there's this phrase, obviously, that's used over and over and over again. I think rightfully so, right? The phrase never again. And it seems like a lot of people in their heads are thinking that the phrase never again only applies whenever Jewish people are attacked. But the again can happen as long as it's the Palestinian people, then never again gets thrown out the window. I mean, is that what we're saying here? That genocide is okay? Sometimes. You get to do a little genocide on the side, Well, you guys went through, a historic atrocity. Therefore, you kind of get a free pass, right? And it's so disgusting to me. But anyways, we have Netanyahu here, who also put out a statement, and he called it discrimination against the Jewish state. I mean, again, discrimination, because you're being held accountable in the International Court of Justice, the highest court for the United Nations. I mean, yeah, discrimination. Utterly ridiculous, man. We also had this. Now, I did see some news organizations who are doing a great job of covering this, right? Obviously, again, shout out to The Intercept and Jeremy Scahill. They've been tracking this very closely the whole time. A few other ones had more reasonable headlines, but I did think this was interesting that the New York Times decided to run this as their headline. I mean, of everything that we just talked about, of the actual evidence of this case, the overwhelming rulings against Israel, and they decided to go with UN court declines to demand Israel stop its military campaign. It's not the main takeaway. It's a part of the story, sure, but to frame what just happened in this light is delusional. It's pretty fucked up. And then I'll finish off here just by linking this down below. If you guys want to go read the entirety of what was just dropped today, this ICJ case, they tweeted it out. They got a link to it right here. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll put that down in the description if you guys want to go read the whole thing for yourself. But, I mean, listen, again, I read the original South Africa case that was brought forward. To say it was convincing would be a massive understatement. To me, it's basically black and white. I mean, you could take so many different aspects of it. Again, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the mass slaughter of civilians themselves, the intentional targeting of journalists and hospitals and mosques and schools and all of that, along with these statements surrounding the case, from top Israeli officials who do make influential decisions in terms of how this war is being conducted, cross-comparing the statements from guys like Benjamin Netanyahu with what the soldiers are saying on the ground. The Amalek example was a big one. Go and destroy everything, every ox, camel, sheep, man, woman, child, and then soldiers chanting that on the ground as they are in the acts of committing war crimes. I mean, it really should have been a very easy decision here to make, especially when you're only determining the plausibility that there may be a risk of genocide. And luckily they did come down on the right side of that for the most part. Again, didn't get that ceasefire order. It's still, I think, going to be impactful. And so we'll have to keep talking about this over the next couple of days. I'm sure there's going to be, a whole host of different, added aspects of this and tangents that need to be discussed. But this is definitely, as much as you could possibly get a small W, a small win in this horrific of a situation, this looks like it was, leaning in that direction at least.